All right, today we have a very special episode of the podcast. We're going to be doing an interview. Today we're going to be interviewing Pastor Matthew Beem.
Hi, Caden.
Hello, how are you?
Doing great.
Epic. So I'm going to get right to the questions. I'm going to start off with, so you're a pastor, correct?
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, what's your opinion on the state of religion in this country as we move towards a more secular, basis? They teach evolution in schools, and it's generally heading towards more, atheism and such.
Yeah. I think you're right. We do see that trend. We see a downward trend in people who attend church or people who claim to be an adherent of any kind of a faith. In my line of work, we talk a lot about what we call the rise of the nuns. What do I mean by nuns? I don't mean Catholic nuns. I mean that when people check a box on how do they identify mainline Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, there's a box at the bottom that says none. And we have more and more people who are checking the box that says none. We have the rise of the nuns. So we certainly see plenty of downward trends. Our church is facing challenges. Churches in our area, I don't know if you know this, Caden, but we live in the least churched part of the United States. So New Hampshire and Vermont wins the gold medal for having the least amount of people who attend church. The upper Northwest would be second place to us, Portland and Washington. So that can be a little disheartening. Now, I grew up outside the church. I didn't grow up with any faith. That's another story, but I know both sides. I've been on both sides of this. But I certainly would love to see our area, especially, return to faith. Now, I have some hope too, which is that this isn't the first time we've seen this in our country, and it's perhaps not even the worst point we've been at. We have at other points in our nation's history when we had very low church attendance, very low adherence to any sort of a faith. I'm thinking about the early to mid 1800s, the frontier movement, where people were moving out west, and there just wasn't a lot of development and structure to people's lives, and there just weren't churches and church attendance, and even people claiming to have any kind of a faith was very low at that point. They might believe in some sort of vague God up there somewhere, but not a lot of coherence to it. That gave rise to the Great Awakenings. We had the First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening. We had a guy named John Wesley started the Methodist movement in the United States, which became one of the biggest Christian movements. And they had pastors who were circuit riders who would ride from one village to another, to another, to another, to another, preaching the word of God. And religion and faith flourished out of a time that was sort of a low point. So the fact that we're trending downward doesn't have to mean it's always going to head downward. It doesn't mean the end of the world is near. But your observation's right. We're trending down, and it would be nice to see things go in the other direction, if anything, because it seems that any society, for it to have some kind of cohesiveness and to have longevity, needs to believe in something greater than itself. And what we have with the elimination of God is it throws everything back on us. And we say, well, we have to be the answer to our own problems. We have to come up with the solutions ourselves. We are our own gauge of right and wrong. And time again in history, we've seen that doesn't work. We need something greater than ourselves. And so I would certainly hope that God brings a fresh move in our country so that we can cry out to him to be our God.
Yeah, that makes sense. We definitely need some kind of solution to this problem, because as you can see, as we toward more, focus on the self, like we did during the Renaissance, it gets more and more destructured, and I have a bunch of people trying to look inward and figure out what they are as opposed to turning to God. And then you get a bunch of crazy identity labels and a bunch of identity politics, which is never good for a society. And as well as the deterioration of the moral standard. where you can't really have any morals if you don't have anything to look inward or to look to for the moral code, like the Bible or God Himself. So, if these are
Yeah,
the problems that we can identify, what do you think are some of the solutions to get more people into church, to get more people into, God and a higher power?
that's a eternal question that people like me are always trying to wrestle with. And if I had the answer, um, well, I could write a lot of books and I could have a church that's full of folks. Um, sometimes it just requires a crisis, which is something that I can't engineer. People just need to realize that they need something. We look into the Old Testament. Um, I think of the book of Judges. The book of Judges says that at that time, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Everybody just looked to their own feelings for what was right and wrong. So you can see that, I mean, this is eons ago, and people had times when they just looked to their own feelings for what was right and wrong, and it got them in a downward spiral, and things came apart, and then they would cry out, and God would send someone to deliver them, and then they would continue on, and they would come back down again and do what was right in their own eyes. And at least in the book of Judges, it was what seemed like a never-ending cycle. Um, so sometimes it just takes a crisis. It takes people to be drowning to realize they need help, and I can't do anything about that.
Right.
Where I stand, I think it's just important that churches get back to the heart of what our faith is, which is that there's a God who loves us, a God who loved us enough to send His only begotten Son, to give His life for us, to stand in place for us so that we need not face the penalty for the things we do. He took that for us, and He wants to love us and set us free and remake us in His image. We Christians talk about this word gospel. Gospel isn't just a kind of music, but gospel is a code name, if you will, for our message. And gospel means good news. So Christians need to remember that we're out there to be speaking good news, words of hope, words of love, words of truth, rather than preaching doom and condemnation, which is something that unfortunately Christians have been rather good at. So preaching good news and just being willing to love the people around us.
Right.
Yeah.
So my next question is, I know that since you're not, the most well versed in Catholicism, being a Baptist preacher, and just the usual Christian, and Catholicism is kind of much different. But as you can see nowadays, a lot of people in politics, I can think of a few examples like AOC, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg. They tend to call themselves either Catholics or Christians, and in my opinion, that's an effort to misrepresent the faith of people like us who are actual Christians that are true to the Bible, and try to distort what it says. So it seems like that we're the minority of Christians that believe all these old and oppressive standards. What's your opinion on a lot of these political figures trying to, identify as religions that they aren't?
Yeah. Um, well, the first thing I would have to do is to point the finger back at myself. Jesus said, before you look at a speck in someone else's eye, look at the log in your own eye. So the first thing I need to do is understand that I can be as big a hypocrite as anybody. Um, you mentioned that I'm a Baptist minister, which I am right now. I'm ordained with American Baptist churches, but this is my first time in a Baptist church. I've been in many other different Christian churches. And I have Catholic brothers and sisters who I love very much. So I would never single out one kind of Christian among others when it comes to our hypocrisy, because we're all so good at it.
Right.
But Jesus did talk about hypocrisy. He talked about God all throughout the Bible talks about paying lip service to Him. They honor me with their mouths, but their hearts are far from me. That was something that I think the prophet Isaiah spoke, speaking for God. They honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And what God cares about is not our outward action, not our lips or our speech, or whether or not we're a famous politician, but He cares about our hearts and whether or not we come with humble hearts before Him, broken and ready to receive His grace and His mercy. So all I could do is tell for anybody is to point them back to Jesus. Forget about Catholic, Protestant, forget about Methodist, Baptist, all of that. Forget about Republican, Democrat. Like, I believe that Jesus was God in the flesh, that He came to die on a cross for us, that He rose from the grave, and that anybody who wants to trust in him and follow him with their whole life and their whole heart can know God and be saved. And so that makes Christianity the most inclusive religion in the world. I mean, literally any person, Republican, Democrat, Protestant, Catholic, Muslim, Baptist, right? Any person, if they will trust in Jesus, can know God and can be saved. And to me, that's just beautiful. And so I would just continue to point people back to Jesus. So if I were to sit and talk to somebody, you mentioned AOC or some politician, and if we were going to talk about matters of faith, I would want to know about her relationship with Jesus and whether she's following him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the great thing is that we can have a way of measuring that because Jesus spoke, right? Here's my Bible, and
Should have brought
especially when
mine
it,
down.
that's okay. You know, it comes to Jesus. My Bible happens to have the words of Jesus in red in the Gospels. And so if you want to know what Jesus said, you can go look at what he said, and then I can measure my life against that.
Right.
And I can say, well, am I following Jesus? And someone else can do that too. And in the end, other people are going to stand before God on their own. I'm going to stand before God on my own. And it's up to them whether their life lines up with those words in red and all the rest too, because it's all good and it's all God.
I definitely agree with what you said about how all of the denominations will tie into each other in one way or another. I personally consider myself non-denominational. I believe, Jesus died on the cross for our sins and, everything in the Bible. But I will point out, and this directly segues into the next topic I'd like to talk about, which is, AOC and Joe Biden, just to pick out a few, have always been in their lives strong advocates for abortion, which
Yeah.
is like directly against the Catholic doctrine. So I have a hard time understanding how people still consider them to be Catholic, because I would personally, I can't make judgments of them because I don't know, but I would probably make a safe bet that Joe Biden doesn't believe in most of the Bible, but that's just a bet.
Yeah.
But I would definitely like to ask you, as I previously stated, that it would segue into the next topic. What's your opinion from a minister's perspective on abortion?
Mm. Yeah. It breaks my heart, you know, and I think probably when I was younger, I was a little more wishy-washy on it. And as I get older and as I start to develop more convictions about what this life is about and what matters in this life, um, I think that the God who wants us to stand up for all people, especially those who are cast out, especially those who don't have a voice. I can't think of anyone who has less of a voice in this world than the unborn. They have no one to defend them. And I do believe that they're people. Um, I, I would not be surprised, this is my own theory and I won't be around to test it, but I would not be surprised if in 200 years, our culture looks at abortion in the way that we now look back on slavery. Something that was commonly accepted, something that you just did because it was the way of the world at the time, something that degraded a certain class of human beings because we claimed that a certain class of human beings were not actually human beings and therefore we could treat them however we wanted to. And it was a long process for people who were slaves to be recognized as being fully human, made in the image of God. And once we recognized they were fully human, made in the image of God, then we recognize they deserved rights. And right now, it seems that the unborn is a class of people who don't have a voice and who aren't recognized as being fully human. So I wonder if our society might, in 200 years, look back on abortion like we look back on slavery. And I think the church has a part to play in that. I've had an opportunity to teach ethics at a local community college, and I teach Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham City Jail, which is a phenomenal piece of writing if you haven't read it. And in it, King laments that Christians, with regard to the racism issues in America, weren't quite active. They weren't making a difference. And he points out that in the early days of the church, Christians put a stop to two things in Roman society. One of them was gladiatorial combat, when people would fight each other to the death for sport. Christians played a big part in ending that. And the other one is what he calls infanticide, which is the killing of children outside the mother's body after they were born. If there was a child who was disfigured, or who was maybe a girl, because girls are killed at a higher rate than boys, whether we're talking about abortion today or back in the first century. King laments that Christians aren't like they were in the first century. Christians put a stop to this thing called infanticide, which was leaving children to die out in the desert. And he thinks Christians should be more effective at bringing justice to our world today. Now, he was talking about racism, and we might talk about abortion today. Now, an interesting thing to point out, though, is that the way Christians brought about a change in the first century is that they went out and they found those babies that were left to die, and they took them in, and they loved them, and they raised them. They took those who were unwanted. And getting back to our own hypocrisy as Christians, I think Christians could do a better job of taking in, fostering, adopting kids who are unwanted. And I count myself among that. My wife and I are blessed with a child of our own. But I feel this growing conviction that if I'm going to care about kids, then we should actually do that in a way that's tangible. To quote a pretty reputable and respected Catholic, Mother Teresa, who did work in India working with the poor and the sick and the disenfranchised. She came to America and she did speak at the White House about abortion. I think it was at the White House. And she said, if you don't want these kids, give them to us because we will find a place for them. She was calling our bluff. She said, if you don't want these kids, fine, but send them over to us and we will care for them. And if the church could stand and say that, all right, you don't want these kids, fine, we will care for them and we will love them. I think that would speak volumes in our world today. So I think that's an area where the church could grow when it comes to this topic, including me.
That makes sense. I would definitely like to respond to that, but I first have to apologize. I just realized that this entire segment, it's looked like I've been looking at the ground because of my weird camera angle on my computer. So I'd like to apologize for that.
All right. We're still recording though, right?
Yeah, that's true. It just
All
looks
right.
like I'm looking at the floor instead. So about what you said, I definitely agree with you 100% about your opinion on abortion. I think it's a really intelligent comparison to compare it to slavery. I'd never thought about that before. And I do think that Christians need to step up a little bit with the adoption process. For newborns, there's definitely a long waiting list of babies that are ready to be adopted. But unfortunately and sadly for them, they're probably going to get bounced around a little bit because there's not a lot of strong adoption. The people that want to adopt children nowadays, and yeah, so I'd have to definitely agree with you on those points. The next issue that I'd like to ask you about from a minister's perspective is nowadays in like recent times, you can definitely see a trend upward. Excuse me. You can definitely see a trend upward in the younger generation in LGBTQ participancy. Like I think it was 3% more kids identify with in these groups, which is really scary because it's definitely being I can't speak promulgated in today's media to be these things because we have a more, and I use this term very loosely, accepting society for kids to come out and say that they are these things. And it's definitely that worrying because as we talked about earlier, as a first question, the advance towards secularism in the country. I think that those two definitely tie in strongly. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah. I could look at it from, let's see, from a scientific perspective, from a ethical perspective, and then from a spiritual or religious Christian perspective. I'm not as up on the science and the studies as I should be, although I do know that there are those who are doing studies who say that we're seeing an explosion of those who are identifying with what we might call non-traditional sexualities. And they don't really have an explanation for it. So in other words, 20 years ago, you might have a very small percent of the population, generally boys, who would express something they call gender dysphoria, which would be, and they would express it at a very young age. Some girls, but it was generally boys, and it was it was an infinitesimally small percentage of the population. But in the last 15, 10, I don't know how many years, I can't quote it, but there's been an explosion of mainly teenage girls who are suddenly all, identifying as transgender. And from a social science point of view, it's very interesting to
Yeah.
say, okay, so what's driving this? And I'm not going to point any fingers right now. I'm just going to point out that we're seeing changes that we've never seen before and seem to be explained by mere biology. They can't seem to be explained merely by DNA. There seem to be other social factors that might be driving it. So that's really
Yeah.
interesting. Um, so that would be the social point. From an ethical point of view, we talked about the fact that there's no more measuring stick in terms of how we decide what's right or wrong and how we
Right.
decide to express ourselves. It all comes down to our personal feelings now. So I'm not surprised at all if now we're looking to our feelings instead of some more objective standard of right and wrong, that more people are going to express themselves differently than they have in the past. So that's not surprising to me at all, that happens when you go to a subjective standard of goodness rather than an objective standard one. And then, from a Christian spiritual standpoint, uh, the Bible says in the beginning, God created people and he made them male and female.
Right.
Right. And I fall back on that a lot. I won't get into theories of creation, whether he made them male and female in 6 days or whether he made them male and female over a long process over 25 billion years, whatever it was. I don't even care about that debate so much, but it does say God made them male and female, and throughout the Bible, which I take as the narrative that defines my life, I see that God brings together man and woman, and he brings together man and woman for the purpose of bringing about new life. Now, you can get into all kinds of questions about, a man having multiple wives in the Old Testament, all that kind of stuff. You can try to poke holes in all of this, and I get it. We may not have time to go there right now, but I do see just this basic sense that God created male and female. Now, that for me as a Christian is going to be the narrative that defines my life, and so I'm going to look to that. Whether I have feelings that point me one way or another way, I'm going to go back and say, all right, God, I think this is how you made us. Now, the Bible also says that very early on, the man and the woman ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree they weren't supposed to eat from. And whether you take that as a literal tree or a figurative one, it tells us that something has gone wrong in this world. And so the fact that things are a certain way doesn't mean that they should be that way. I wish I could remember the philosopher right now. I feel like it was Spinoza, but I can't remember who talked about what he called the is-ought fallacy. The fallacy that to say something is a certain way means that it ought to be that way. And that's not the case. The fact that something, is one way doesn't mean it ought to be. To say it ought to be means we have this other vision of how things should be.
Right.
So to simply say, well, I am this way and I have these feelings doesn't mean we ought to have those feelings, but there's 1,000 other conversations we could have about this. I can only answer for myself as a Christian.
Right.
I can say that what we see in our society is it's perplexing to social scientists. They're trying to figure out what factors are driving this, and there's people far more knowledgeable than I who can give insight into that.
Yeah, it's a very good point. It's definitely a large, expanding issue. There's a few things that I'd like to add. If I'm going to go by the pattern that you presented as your answer, as a social, looking at it through a social lens, a very good material on this would be Abigail Schreier's book. I think it was called Irreversible Damage. And in that book, she wrote a lot of the females nowadays in school will be pressured by their social groups to take on a new identity. And that was a big driving factor in why it was an explosion in the female part. And it's definitely a more accepting culture, in finger quotes, because it's definitely not an accepting culture, but that's what they like to call it, where you can just say whatever you are, nobody really cares. And it's definitely getting bad for the generation because females can just walk into a clinic and say, all right, I'm a man now. And the doctor will be like, all right, here's a syringe filled with, or here's a syringe filled with testosterone, put this in your arm. And it's very concerning because there's you can do that even as young as 5 in some states if your parents allow it. And it's really disturbing. And from a Christian, I like to attribute the big change to a rise in Gnostic dualism on the left which is basically the religion that presupposes that yourself and your soul are two different things instead of, the Christian idea of the Holy Trinity. Or I don't think that's what, like, where your soul and your body and God are one and the same. And so and Gnostic dualism just says, nope, none of that really matters. You can be whatever you want because your body and what you really are different. So just go nuts. And so that's what from a Christian standpoint, like to say caused all this crazy LGBTQ stuff in the younger populations.
Everything that's old is new again, huh? You're talking about Gnosticism, which was a movement in the first century that
Right.
early Christians had to wrestle with, that separated out the body and the soul and led to all kinds of interesting behaviors. And maybe we're seeing that again. That's an interesting observation. I just thought of a woman who you might be interested in looking into. Her name is Camille Paglia, and I think she's a Yale educated, she's a social philosopher, is Yale or Harvard. And she's interesting because she's not a Christian. She is a feminist. I think she might even be a lesbian. But she studied sexuality, and in particular androgyny, which is like this sort of wishy-washy movement between male and female. She studied those dynamics throughout the rise and fall of civilizations, and she's looked at ways that these things come and go in the rise and fall of civilizations. And she has some really interesting things to say. Even though she's a feminist and she's lesbian, she has some huge words of caution about where this is all going and what it means for our society. And I just bring her up because it's always interesting to hear people who might affirm what you believe, but coming from the other side. Because if people are on the other side, I say the other side because, I'm a Christian, I hold these traditional values.
Right.
People who might come from a different perspective, when even they're saying, whoa, hold on a second, slow down. We have something on our hands that's worth paying attention to. So you might be interested to look up Camille Paglia as just another voice in this whole conversation. But the other thing, since I'm here as a pastor, I'm here as a Christian, I'm here as a human being, I just want to add on to it that I believe every human being is made in the image of God.
Right.
No human being is too far from God's grace, and they are loved by God. God desires to bring them to himself. He doesn't desire that anyone should perish, but that all should be saved. And so I know in my life, I strive to treat people with dignity and respect, no matter who they are, no matter how they identify, because to me, what's important is that they know Jesus. So I want everybody to know Jesus. I just want them to know the beauty and the wonder and the power and the majesty and grace and the love that I found in Jesus in a real and present way. And I want straight people to know that. I want black and white people to know that. I want transgender people and gay people, and I just want everybody to know Jesus. So
Right.
that's the thrust of my life, and it's just important I say that because it's easy to leave that off to the side.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Definitely don't think like people are going to call us all sorts of names like transphobes, homophobes, stuff like that. But what you got to realize is I don't fault the transgender individual for what they're doing. I fault the media and the social apparatuses that have prompted them to gain a mental illness. It's not their fault. Like you don't see a schizophrenic person talking to themselves and make fun of the schizophrenic person. You say, "Oh, you have a mental illness. You should probably go get help." Same with transgender people. It's like, "Oh, I'm not going to make fun of you for putting on a dress and saying that you're a woman. I'm going to say you should probably go get some sort of help for your ailment." It's not like you hate the people, you hate the structures that have promoted them to become what has happened to them. It's definitely a tragic story, I'd say.
Yeah. My desire is to lead people to Jesus, and I hope that Jesus will then be their faithful shepherd,
Right.
and he will lead them and where he feels is best.
Yes, I agree. The next question I would like to ask you is in a general social sense, abortion, LGBTQ, and a few other things. You, oh God, excuse that voice crack. In a general sense, I would like to ask, you have your Catholic Church, and I guess Pope Francis is there. He's not really doing much for the whole Catholic doctrine. And then you have your evangelical Christian movement and your Christians in general. I definitely side more with the Christians, as I'm sure you would. I'm guessing you're not a Catholic, as you previously stated, but I do generally believe that down back in the 60s all the way to today, the Christians and the evangelicals have taken more of a progressive turn. There's definitely the few style traditionalist churches, but they closed down churches and they haven't really been as much in the culture war as they should be. Whereas Catholics, I don't agree with Catholics. I don't agree with their religion, but I would say that they're definitely fighting more on the right conservative, traditionalist values side of the culture war. So I'd like to ask you personally, what's your opinion on who do you think is, trying to succeed in winning back the social and moral values? You think the Christian and evangelical movement or Catholic Church and Catholic movement?
Hmm. Boy, that's a tough one. There's a lot to unpack there. You know, this last year and a half has been pretty crazy, and it's certainly upped my thinking in terms of what role Christians should play in our society today. Um, the conservative evangelicals had a strong voice through the 60s and 70s and 80s, the religious right, the moral majority, things like that. Um, I I would caution us from celebrating that too much, because I think that the way that evangelicals did it kind of ended up shooting themselves in the foot. When we frame things in terms of a war, we're now saying someone's the enemy. If we're at war, who's the enemy? And the Bible's very clear. The enemy says that we don't wage war against flesh and blood, but against principles and authorities and powers in the dark heavenly places, right? In the
Right.
spiritual realm.
Good and evil.
So yeah, and we don't use weapons as the world uses weapons. And so sometimes when we frame things in terms of a war, and evangelicals have done that, we've made enemies when we shouldn't have. So the question is, how do we bring about change? The early church, so it's very ironic, the early church uh, outlasted the Roman Empire. The early church overtook the Roman Empire, and yet they did it without ever trying to overtake the Roman Empire. No one in the first century was saying we need to take Rome back for God.
Right.
Nobody in the first century was saying we need a Christian society. What they said is we need to be faithful to Jesus. And we're going to be faithful to the Jesus to the point where it will cost us our lives. And that witness of people who were faithful to Jesus to the point that it even cost them their lives, regardless of where society was headed,
Right.
that ended up infecting society in the most beautiful way. Because everybody said, what is this? Who are these Christians who are submitting their lives to this king who we can't even see? And we're killing them. And they're going willingly, saying, you know what? We believe he's going to raise us again. So it's started to change people's thinking. If they had gone to, the capital of Rome and banged on the door and said, we need you to pass some Christian laws here. We need you to change things in our favor. Probably it wouldn't have brought about much change, but being faithful to Christ as a witness in the middle of a broken world totally rocked the Roman Empire. So uh, I think there are ways to engage in our culture. I'm cautious about how we do it. I'm cautious in terms of how we talk about it and how we treat the people that we're trying to engage with. And I just want to bring us back to, for me, it's always about faithfulness to Jesus. And if the world is going crazy, okay, it will, but the greatest change I can bring about in this world is to change myself and to be a different sort of person in this
Right.
world, right? And pastor a community who are going to be a different sort of people in this world as a witness to something greater than ourselves. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
I mean, it
that's
kind of
where I
does.
come from.
I understand that. When you went all the way back through the Catholic Church and or the church in general and its history, that made me think of a definitely much harder question than the one that I just asked. So get ready for a real toughie.
All right.
Back in, I think it was the 1500s, you had the Protestant Reformation, where Martin Luther pinned those 95 problems that he had with the church to the wall. And then the Catholic Church kind of, dissipated, lost a bunch of members. And John Calvin and the King of England, or yeah, it was King Henry the 13th, I want to say, take that with a grain of salt. Martin Luther and a few other ones. Oh God, excuse the voice crack again. So a few other ones made a bunch of religions as the Catholic Church started to fall down. Lutheranism, Anabaptism, and and how do you, it's Anglicanism, I'm pretty sure. That's always been a hard one for me to pronounce. And Calvinism. Which one do you think stayed true, the most true to the source material? Meaning the Bible and God.
Yeah, I I don't know that I could give an answer to that one. I don't know. I'm still striving myself to be true to the God who I find in Scripture,
Hmm.
and I think they were all trying to. I think that pretty sure Martin Luther is on record as saying that he never wanted to fragment the church. He wanted to reform the church, but he
Right.
never wanted to fragment the church. He wanted unity. Um, so it depends how you measure what is, what makes something true. The Bible talks about the unity of Christians, and the Catholic Church has done a far better job of maintaining a unity, even with a diversity of belief under their big umbrella that they have. At least saying we are the Roman Church, right? They have a certain card to play there. But then each of those movements picked issues that they felt were important at the time, and they really focused on those issues, and that created movements around them. But yeah, to say which one is right, I can't wait for the day when we all stand before God and he and he tells us who was closer. But
Right.
for me, it's less about a movement or a set of beliefs or a denomination, and it's more about a person who
Yeah.
is Jesus, God revealed in the flesh, and I am trying to be faithful to Him where I'm at. And I'm at a Baptist church now. I've been at community non-denominational churches. I've worked at a Methodist church. I was at a Covenant Church, which is a Lutheran branch. I've been at many different denominations, and I just strive to be faithful to Jesus. And surprisingly, I found a lot of people in all those different denominations who are also striving to be faithful to Jesus. And it's been really encouraging to me to be part of so many different kinds of churches and go, oh, we go by different names, but we really are striving to be faithful to Jesus. Sometimes you'll hear a phrase, couple of phrases, they mean the same thing, to major in the majors and minor in the minors. So we try to major in those things that are most important, and those things that are minor, we minor in those things. Um, there's another phrase which slips my mind, but in the core things, unity, and in the things that are not core, charity. So when I look at my Christian brothers and sisters, we have certain things that we believe in. God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He's given us His Word. Jesus died for our sins and rose again, and He will return again to judge the living and the dead. Like, that's something that Catholics and Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians and Anglicans, we all believe those things. And so our core is actually quite similar. And the ways that we're different are the things that are out to the edges. So if we can major in the majors, we'll go a lot further towards having some kind of unity among Christian believers, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Personally, as I've already stated, I'm definitely non-denominational. Back in where the Protestant Reformation happened, when the church got all fragmented, I'd say there definitely were some far out ones that did definitely try their best to fix a problem, but there were definitely some pretty nutty ones. But I'd say that if I had to answer, this is definitely a hard one because you're then if you answer with one, then you're automatically like discrediting the rest of them, and that's not something that I want to do. But I would say that I think Lutheranism stayed just an inch closer to the Bible than Calvinism and Presbyterianism and such. That's only because the Lutheran doctrine is basically just love God, follow the Bible, and you should be good to go. It it's definitely more nuanced than that, I promise, but you get the general idea. And so it's a little bit difficult and hard to say, but that's probably what I'd answer with.
That's, I like your answer. I know some Calvinists who would love to debate you on that, and
Right.
I would much rather they debate you than me.
I definitely dislike the idea of Calvinism because it has a few core ideas, but it's so hard to like wrap your head around what they actually mean. Like when they say you're predestined to go to heaven, that could either mean you're predestined, whatever you do, you can get to go to heaven, or it means God knows everything that's going to happen, so why even try? So and
Yeah,
then there's a few
yeah,
other principles that of Calvinism that are definitely have some meanings that you can't ask John Calvin about because he was, turned into firewood in the 1500s. But It's really hard to think about.
Maybe you should have a Calvinist on your next episode. I think it'd be great, Kate.
I think that's a good idea. So my next question is definitely more of a political issue than
Yeah.
a religious issue, but you can definitely answer from a religious perspective. There are a lot of institutions in the U.S. at this point that teach atheism, and just to name a few, the universities and the Ivy Leagues, like Harvard, basically funded by Mao in the 1960s to teach communism. You got, social media, which silences a lot of the, Christian ideas and morality. Like, you criticize one person who's trying to tell all the kids to turn transgender, and you automatically get banned. It's definitely a far out example, but you get the idea. So social media, the Ivy Leagues and a few others definitely don't have our best interests at heart. If you could eliminate one of them, what one would it be?
Give me my options again. If I could eliminate what?
If you could eliminate one institution in the USA that you think has strayed the most from traditional morality, which one would it be?
Oh boy. Yeah, I don't know. That's a hard question to answer because institutions aren't just things; they're made up of people.
Right.
And so, when you talk about eliminating an institution, well, where would the people go,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Um, so, which has strayed the most? I guess I would just say that there's a spirit that's behind all of them. Getting back to where is the real war? Where is the real battle? The battle is against the dark powers that
Right.
are working behind all these things. And so, sure, they're dark powers are in universities and they're in government and they're on social media, and that's it's a tricky one. This isn't answering your question, but I just think that free speech is so important, and I've been awakened to that in the last year and a half, that the right to have free and open debate is just so important for a thriving society, and that's something that I think any person could say, whether Christian or not. That shouldn't matter. Um, but just to be able to have free and open debate, and we absolutely have seen the debate got shut down. We have monopolies on our communication tools, like our social media tools, Facebook and
Right.
YouTube. And so
See how long
those
this one lasts.
yeah, yeah, those monopolies are having an effect on our ability to have free speech. So I think everybody should be standing up for the right for free speech. My dad had a saying he used to love to tell me when I was a kid, which was that I may not agree with what you say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it.
I can tell you
And
exactly where that's from. That's a Voltaire quote.
that's Voltaire.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Who, by the way, was a raving atheist and anti-Christian, right?
Right.
So we can have allies with people who aren't necessarily part of our tribe when it comes to these major issues.
Right.
Um, so, yeah, God bless Voltaire.
He was an
And
alright
God
man.
bless.
He was definitely an atheist though, which kind of sucked. But
Oh yeah,
he had some
absolutely.
bangers of quotes.
Yeah, yeah. But he believed in a free society, right? He
Right.
believed he should be free to pursue his way of life and his ethics as he saw fit. And we are definitely seeing a loss of that attitude about that. I you referenced another book earlier,
Abigail
and
Shrier.
yeah, Abigail Shrier, and I'll throw out another one that I think I finished reading, which is called The Coddling of the American Mind. Have you heard of this book at all?
It
And
sounds familiar, but at the same time, I don't think so.
right,
Possibly.
John Haidt is one of the writers, and now the other name I'm blanking on, but The Coddling of the American Mind was written by two university professors who consider themselves to be classic liberals. Now, they're using the term liberal in a philosophical sense, in the
Yeah.
way that we believe in a society where people can use reason and open dialogue to
Yeah.
discuss issues and to arrive at our best solutions, right?
That is definitely a discussion where you can get into for a very long time. Because back before, I'd say like the 1900s, but personally, I'd say before Eisenhower, liberal had a much different meaning. Liberal education, liberal democracy. Those were all good things. But then nowadays, people use liberal like I want to go kill my child at Planned Parenthood. So it's a much different discussion.
There's a political liberal and philosophical, right? So
Yeah.
these guys are considering themselves to be philosophical liberals, open to the free exchange of ideas. And they wrote this book because they're incredibly concerned with what they saw in their university campuses starting around the year 2013, 14, where students were coming in who just refused to talk about things that were hard. And they do I think, a fantastic analysis of what it is that happened, starting with kids who were born in around 1990 or so, mid 1990s, what it was unique about their upbringing that was different about than the upbringing of other generations in our country, and what led to a whole generation of young people who are so uncomfortable uh, talking about things that bother them that they won't even do it. And so we have a lot of young people who are driving the movement to shut down free speech, and it's very concerning. It's incredibly concerning, and that's not something that just Christians should be concerned with. That's something that every citizen should be concerned with, because once you take away free speech, that really can be the beginning of the end. When you look at totalitarian, authoritarian regimes that have come in, they always start with speech.
Oh yeah.
So the fact that we're dictating speech is incredibly concerning for all free people everywhere in our society.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with you there. Free speech is an integral. I mean, it was the First Amendment that they ever made, so you know it's got to be a good one. And you definitely got to have free speech in a society, because if one dominant idea, no matter how vile or good, excuse me for the voice crack again, I got to really get a rein on that. Must have slept with my mouth open last night. But if you have one dominant regime that can control all the flow of information and ideas, there's never going to be any free discourse, and there's never going to be, it's never going to be easy to dethrone that institution or have any idea of how to stop it if there's no communication of people, of like-minded individuals. Like, this was definitely leading into the next question, but the media nowadays, it's not even trying to hide how far left it's gotten in the recent years. It's such a biased media that you can't really even get your information from, you turn on to cable news. Unless you go to like Fox at a specific hour, there's no chance they're going to get any actual news, just, you know, political one-sided opinions that claim to be unbiased. So, you know, free speech is definitely necessary. That's it.
Mm.
So what I'd like to ask you next, as I kind of alluded to in the last question,
Mhm.
what's your opinion on the media nowadays?
Ah, well, I just try to be careful with what I watch, and I try to remember that the media is a business,
Right.
and that's true for conservative media and liberal media. Um, and in some sense, I think the fact that the media are biased isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as you know they're biased.
Right.
So the freedom of the press, we use that term press because it comes from the original printing press, right? And the press was originally used to write up pamphlets and short papers that were trying to push a view. And so you had more progressive presses that were pressing certain ideas, and you had other conservative ones that were pressing other ideas, Whigs and Tories, whoever were the parties at the time. And as long as you knew what their bias was, you could read it and say, all right, that's interesting. And then you could read the other and say, all right, that's interesting.
Yeah.
What might be more troublesome is when we claim that we don't have bias. And if there's anything that we have learned from the postmodern era, it's that everybody does have a bias. We all claim to be standing in the middle. Everybody wants to think they're standing in the middle.
Nobody really
But
is, though.
right, the fact is we're not. And so I just try to remember that there's a bias there, and okay, that's okay. Um, I know that they're a business and they are trying to get me to watch, whether it's liberal or conservative. So I try to remember that. And especially more traditional, I think we call it legacy media, is dying. Television is dying and newspapers are dying. And so as they're dying, um, they're getting more and more frantic in their attempts to keep us watching and to keep us
Right.
reading. And so I just try to remember that that's going on there. Um, there will always be bias, and among those that are dying, there's even more bias because they're trying to get those hooks in us to get a reaction.
Yeah.
Um, so as long as you remember that and you do your homework, hopefully we can wade our way through it. And I hope that there will be room for a whole crop of new media outlets to pop up so that we can get more voices in the room, as biased as they might be. Let's have more voices. That's what I'm in favor of, is more voices. And I hope that our technology will give us space to do that, and that those voices won't get shut down. Right now they're getting shut down,
Oh yeah,
but I hope we'll see this era pass. I'm hopeful.
right. I definitely agree with you. The problem is that when these media outlets say, "Oh, I'm unbiased. I'm just telling you the news," it's like, no, you're definitely not doing that. If you're gonna be biased, at least say it. And the problem is that people, and this is gonna sound very sharp and malignant, but people are stupid. A lot of people just like watch the news and be like, "Oh yeah, this makes sense," and then they don't even realize that it's definitely not the news. One of my favorite quotes is, I think it was Churchill, that said the greatest argument against democracy is a 30-minute conversation with the average voter. And it's like, yeah, I know people don't really understand the way that these media companies are trying to try to get in your brain and tell you these things to try to keep alive, because they're a business, as you said. So I definitely have to agree with you there.
Yeah. This is a little off color comment, but an attempt at humor. I think I read a George Carlin comment recently. He was a humorist. He was a stand-up comedian in the 70s and 80s, and he said, think about how stupid the average person is, and then remember that 50% of them are more stupid than that.
You
Now,
know what surprised me is that I was actually just about to say that exact same quote.
you know the quote. I guess it's
Yeah.
making the rounds a
I
lot lately.
I didn't
But
know
you
that it
know
was
what?
George Carlin though. That is surprising to me.
It could be misattributed. I don't know. But let me add a couple of things to that.
Right.
One is that I may well be in the lower 50%, right? So it's a funny quote, but we all have a tendency to think that others are more stupid than us. And right now, the reason that quote is making the rounds is because everybody thinks that it applies to others and not to themselves.
Exactly.
When I use that quote, I'm admitting my own arrogance, because I'm thinking I'm in the top 50%. I may well not be.
Yeah.
So I say it's an attempt at humor, but um, I may be the stupidest guy in the room right now. I don't know.
I mean, anybody could. Nobody really can quantify that. There's no like test.
Yeah.
Even IQ tests at this point are skewed. Well,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say skewed, but like they're not always entirely accurate about which with the numbers that you're trying to get. You can't quantify intelligence.
No.
Everybody posts that and like without disclaimering that they might be on any part of the spectrum. It's like there's a 50% chance that they are trying to tell that to other people rather than look inward on themselves. And so that's definitely a good point about that quote. I did not know that was George Carlin. After you finished your quote, I was going to say, I got another funny one. And then you said, and then you started reading the exact same quote. And I was like, oh,
Check the source on that, because
actually,
you know Abraham Lincoln once said that half the things on the internet aren't true.
I get it. It's Abraham Lincoln. Live fact check. Hold on. Who was George Carlin? It was George Carlin.
All right.
You were right. That's the point. So the last question that I'm going to ask is, do you have any closing statements? Any fun facts or anything that you want to say to the audience before we close off this interview?
No, I think I would just say personally, Caden, I'm just very encouraged. I'm encouraged that you're doing this. I'm encouraged that you're clearly a thoughtful young man, and you're trying to use your gifts for a force of good. And I would encourage you to keep at this. I would speak to anyone who's watching to stand up for free speech, and to remember that if we can't talk to each other and we can't honor one another as human beings, then there's not much hope for us. So, as an American, I think our values as a free society, including free speech, are so important, and I want to respect everybody's right to express themselves um, as they see fit. And as a Christian, I believe that all human beings are made in the image of God, which means that all human beings have value, no matter what corner they might be standing in. And there was another guy. He was Father gosh, he's a Catholic priest, and he started something in LA called Homeboy Industries, which is a ministry to guys who are in gangs. And he he brings in guys from gangs and he gives them work. And he says one of the sayings they have there at Homeboy Industries is nothing stops a bullet like a job. And I think that's a great quote. But he has a TED talk, if you're familiar with the TED talks, and he has a great TED talk online. And he says, imagine a circle of compassion that's large enough that no one is standing outside of it. And I try to remember that that's like the arms of God, that God is these arms that are infinitely large and can bring in anybody who wants to come to him as Father. And so I just want to remind people that every human being has dignity. And yes, we can have these debates, and we should have these debates. And that doesn't mean that every answer is equally good or equally right. I think some answers are more right than others, and some views are more right than others. But we
Said it
should be
right in
able
the
to.
sentence. Some views are more right than others.
Yeah, right. I do believe that, because we do have an objective truth against which we measure things, which is God.
Right.
But I believe in the right of all people to be able to have this discourse and to treat one another with respect as we go. So I hope that your viewers would take that path, and I trust that you will too.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for what you said in the beginning too. I do really appreciate that. Definitely agree with you about free speech, and I really do appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you.
I appreciate you having me. Good for you, Caden.
Thank
God
you.
bless you.
All right. God bless you. I'm going to stop the recording.